So our third presentation for part one is from two of our colleagues at the Association of Science Education, Vicki and Rebecca. They are going to be signposting and talking about some of the fantastic initiatives that they are running in schools. Some very practical takeaways, 2 things you can all go and do in school on Monday to make your classroom more inclusive. So welcome, Rebecca and Vicki. It's fab to have you here. Looking forward to listening and learning from you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, so my name is Vicki and I'd like to introduce my colleague Rebecca as well. Thanks for the introduction there. As they said, we're from the Association for Science Education and we're working on an Inclusion in Schools project. We are recruiting secondary schools, so if you're interested in that, please do follow the links that are coming through in the chat, get in contact and we can talk to you about signing your school up. We're very interested in talking to you about that. What we'd like to talk to you today is 2 things that you can do in your classroom on Monday to make it more inclusive for your students. So there's a sort of quick win, but laying the foundations that will lead to more inclusive practice for your students. And the first thing that we're going to talk to you about is your language, so inclusive language. This is really important because obviously communication in a school is key. That's your communication when you're talking to your students, it's your communication in your PowerPoints, it's your communication in your posters around your school, it's the communication that you hear between your students, it's the communication between your colleagues in the staff room, in the parents, it's the whole school community. It's everything. It's absolutely integral to everything that's going on. So a couple of tips around that. And we just want to share a couple of personal experiences to show that we're all still learning on this journey. So my personal one, and I totally blame my PGCE mentor for this one, because he actually said to me to address my classes as guys because it was less formal. And as I thought about this, I was like, guys is not inclusive. It's not inclusive of my female students. It's not inclusive of my students who don't identify as male. It's not inclusive of those who may be questioning their gender identity. Even though some people consider it a gender neutral term, it really isn't. But because it's so sort of ingrained in our cultural language, it was a really difficult one to break and I really had to train myself away from it. But I have trained it out of my language. So I know some people have used spoke. That's something that I've heard people use. It doesn't sit comfortably with me. I use people a lot. So I will often address them as, right, okay, lovely people, this is what we're going to do now. I teach science, so I'll be, right, lovely scientists, this is what we're going to do. Or year 8, right, books away, off we go, this is what we're going to do. So there are collective terms I can use with my class, which does not involve using their gender in any way, shape or form, but does actually include everyone in that classroom. Rebecca, you had some really nice examples.
Yeah, thank you, Vicki. Yeah, language is so important and it underpins everything that we do. And that's why it fits in with today's theme of legacy. You know, it's something that we can start on today and we do need practice with it and we can get better. So don't worry if you do make mistakes. Inclusive language seeks to treat all people with respect, dignity and impartiality. And the examples that I wanted to give were, get your mums to sign your homework diaries tonight. This one could be initially seen as an innocent instruction to a class, but for the child that's sitting there that doesn't have a mum at home, or maybe, you know, have a different situation, the mum's sick or it's, you know, living away from home or any number of circumstances that deviates from the supposed norm, then this can have a really big impact on how they feel. It can make them feel more different. It can affect their mental well-being and ultimately affect their ability to engage with the lesson. We must also remember that it's reinforcing a stereotype. So, you know, there are children that maybe have a mum at home, but it's further evidence that this is normal and this, you know, potentially is a better, you know, could be seen as a better way of living. Which, you know, is just not the message that we want to give. So the second example I wanted to give was nitty gritty. And this is something I only recently learned about. And even saying it and even having it on that screen just feels really uncomfortable because I've learned that it has its origins in the slave trade and it is offensive. And I didn't know that. I was ignorant to that and would use it. And there are lots of phrases that I'm sure that I don't know the origin of and, you know, would feel the same. So I'm just trying to avoid using phrases. There are other reasons to avoid using phrases. It's confusing for children who don't know what they mean. It's confusing for our students with neurodiversity and EAL students as well. So there are lots of examples here, and I'm sure you can think of some of your own. And there's lots of examples and lots of context in which these phrases and sayings are said. So what I wanted to do, and in the link that and the email that Hannah's going to send out later, is that there's a document which I quite like that kind of scaffolds a way to respond to discriminatory language, and it's from the Brighton and Hove Safeguarding Children Partnership. It's based around sexist language, but it can be applied to different areas of discriminatory language. And Vicky's going to talk you through some of the ways to respond.
Yeah, that's really important, because as educators, we obviously teach our subjects, but it's really important that we have a wider role in that community. And if we overhear language that's inappropriate, we have a responsibility to talk to our students about why it's inappropriate. We need to challenge that language. We need to step up to them, and we need to explain to them why it's inappropriate. They may know why it's inappropriate and they may be using it offensively, in which case we need to take that organisational approach. We need to be saying something like, the school doesn't tolerate that, and we need to go down that sanctions route. But we need to make sure they understand why it isn't, and we need to say, do you know why it's inappropriate? How would you feel if this was said to you? And engage them in that response, because if we don't educate them, then they're likely to go on and move it forward. As Rebecca was saying, a lot of those phrases I've recently been learning as well have come from the slave trade, and as I learn their origins, they're really shocking and I wouldn't want to be using them. And my understanding of a lot of language is evolving, and I think it's really important that we keep ourselves up to date with it. And another area is language around LGBTQ+, which is constantly evolving. And as a teacher in secondary, I'm constantly trying to keep myself up to date with it. And we've got some links on the screen here, and they'll be coming out on the links online as well, as some people that you can follow to make sure you can keep yourself up to date with that language as well, with some explanations about language which is inappropriate and why it's inappropriate as well. I think it's that understanding why language is inappropriate which gives you that depth of understanding as to why not to use it. And again, when you're talking to your students about why not to use it, that gives you that understanding moving forwards.
Okay, so this brings us to our second tip that you can do in your classrooms on Monday, and it does involve a little bit of homework. So the homework is to try to observe some stereotypes over this weekend. And I'm sorry in advance, because once you start looking for stereotypes, you cannot stop looking, and you also cannot unsee them. So looking for stereotypes, maybe if you're going out into the supermarket this weekend, you might see some Easter eggs that have been helpfully colour-coded, so we know who their intended recipient should be, and making assumptions about their intended recipients. Or maybe watching TV, you might see some patterns in adverts, for example. We're going to bring it back to the classroom, and that's what this graph on the right-hand side is all about. It can start with Easter eggs, but it can end with changing the subject choices and the futures of our young people, which is really what our project is about. The Inclusion in Schools project is about. So we're going to bring it back to the classroom with a few more stereotypes and assumptions. So
yeah. So if you just have a look here, you can see some examples of handwriting. Just think about what assumptions you'd make here. It's possible that you're making an assumption which many people make, which is that girls have good handwriting. This may not seem problematic, and you may even feel that you've seen many books that support this assumption. But we need to consider the impact that this actually has, the wider impact. One of these examples might be that in group work situations, girls are actually more likely to take on note-taking roles because people can read their handwriting. But this means that they're going to miss out on other learning experiences. So I teach science, and they're less likely to take on those practical roles in science because they're taking the notes. But this also then means that boys are more likely to miss out on chances to practice note-taking skills, but also chances to practice their handwriting. So their handwriting's not going to improve. Okay, now you as a teacher have a responsibility to help avoid these situations. So you can rotate these roles. Okay, so on Monday, you can just be aware of this and ask to rotate those roles. But moving forward, you could even just print off a set of lanyards, which you can hand out to your class, and then actually have a more formalized system in place moving forward.
And the last one is to review your lesson resources for Monday and think about the role models, the images, the context, and the stereotypical messages that might come into your lessons. And that's it, although we could talk for a very long time about this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both so much. It's really lovely to see that practical element to the advice that you're giving, and some really important things being raised. So I've got some questions. And one of them is about this idea of using language that is offensive. Now, whenever I do any work on DEI, people say to me, like, what can we say? What can't we say? And so people do genuinely have a fear about getting it wrong. What happens if you get it wrong? What advice would you give to early careers teachers, any teacher, about using language that is non-inclusive and how you deal with the aftermath of that?
I think
go on, go on, Vicki.
I think you have to apologise. I think you have to admit it straight away. In terms of offensive language, I think that's not something I've had recently, but I've got a number of students that are going through the process of changing their gender, and I make the mistake of using the wrong name. So often they're out of school for a period of time, they come back in and I accidentally dead name them. And it's definitely not deliberate, but the way I have dealt with it is an immediate apology, going and speaking to them, explaining it's because I've read their name in the register, whatever it is, and making sure that they know it's not deliberate. And I think my feeling on this is the most important thing is that you don't ignore it, because if you ignore it, it sends the message that it's okay. And you can't do that. If you make the mistake and there's a slip, you talk about the fact that there's an unconscious bias, that you've grown up thinking this language is okay. You've learnt that it's not okay. There's a part of your brain that's still registering that you can use that language. You're trying to unlearn it. You've made a mistake. You're moving forward and you're doing your very best, but you're a human and you're going to make mistakes. If you're still learning, you could actually get your classes involved. You could say, okay, right, I'm trying not to use gendered language. If I use gendered language, okay, I want you to call me out on it. Okay, let me know if I'm doing this. Okay, depends on your classes and what they're like. Okay, but your classes. Okay, get them involved in it. Okay, involve them in it so they actually know what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it, to understand that, like, we're not without mistakes, we're not without the capacity to make mistakes. And I think that idea of not dealing with it because we're scared often prevents the conversations as well. So yeah, really, really important. So Charlotte's got a question in the chat, and she says, what advice would you give to ECTs when we come across texts where language it's from a different time, it uses offensive language? How do you deal with that, either of you?
I think it's an opportunity for discussion. I think, I'm so impressed with, Anna's presentation this morning and Andy's presentation this morning. And what they're doing is they're opening out discussions. And if you need to use that text, if it's part of the curriculum, use it as an opportunity for discussion and to, draw out other themes and to open the eyes and the understanding of our young people. So it's, as I said, try to review your resources before Monday. It's something that you can get into the habit of doing. Just have that awareness of, your role in the classroom to try to educate our young people, not just on the content, not just on the curriculum, but on the wider world and the diversity of the world that we live in.
Obviously there's always one person who doesn't unmute themselves, and that today was me. So yeah, absolutely. And I think this idea that English teachers do navigate this space, and 31 Books has said that English teachers find it very difficult to navigate that issue, talking about context. But you're right, the position that we put ourselves in as explorers of a text allow us to say, look, the language here was of its time. How do we view it now? How do we navigate it now? And Sally has talked about music being littered with offensive language and young people calling each other those terms. Is where do we go to work out what is allowed and not allowed? Is there a source of information that you guys use?
I use the TUC Diversity and Dialogue source, and then I do use the Twitter handles that I put up and the Instagram. So I've handles as well. So I only learned recently, so BAME is no longer deemed the accepted form, and we should be using ethnically diverse as a way of referring, to those categories. But it's difficult, and it is evolving. Language evolves, so yeah, we do need to be proactive and do our homework, unfortunately, and yeah, have those discussions and conversations and be aware of our weaknesses.
I think as well, it's one of those things, if you hear someone use a different term, it's being prepared to ask and say like, oh, that's a term I've not heard, why are you using that? Because they may say, oh, it's because this term is now not appropriate for these reasons, because they may have read something that you haven't read. And it's learning, it's just evolving. And it's really interesting, it's really fascinating when you get into it, and it's evolving so quickly, and it is trying to keep track of it. But yes, it's constantly moving.
It is, yeah. But we are constantly moving and learning as educators. So
yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us this morning. It's been really fascinating to listen to you.